People online are once again losing their minds over Proton, screaming that Proton sold people out, can't be trusted, or that encrypted email is somehow fake now. And this latest round of outrage is coming off reporting from 404 Media, which said a court record showed Proton handed over payment data tied to a Stop Cop City email account to Swiss authorities, who then passed it to the FBI. The reporting says the account was affiliated with Defend the Atlanta Forest, tied to the broader Stop Cop City movement in Atlanta, which authorities were investigating in connection with allegations involving arson, vandalism, and doxing. That context matters, because the story people are reacting to is not Proton decrypted somebody's inbox and handed it over. The reported issue is that payment-linked account data was enough to help identify somebody. And that is a very different conversation. And honestly, I'm getting tired of watching people jump to conclusions without understanding the realities of how the world actually works. So I'm taking some time away from working on my Zero Trust project to talk about this important topic right now. What's going on, everybody? I'm Chief Geeked, and if you're into cybersecurity, Linux, and open source content, make sure to hit like, subscribe, follow all of my socials in the links below, catch me live on stream, and let me know what you think down in the comments below. Now, let's get back into it. The biggest problem here is that way too many people are confusing privacy, anonymity, and encryption as though they all mean the same thing. They do not. Privacy is controlling who has access to your data. Anonymity is hiding who you are. Encryption is how data is protected from being read by parties who do not have the keys or the authorized access. If you blur all three of those together, you are going to come away with the wrong conclusion every single time a story like this drops. Because based on the reporting, Proton did not hand over decrypted mailbox contents. What was reportedly handed over was payment data tied to the account via Swiss legal process. Proton's transparency report says Proton may be legally compelled to disclose certain user information to Swiss authorities, but that Proton has no means to decrypt emails, files, and invites protected by its system, and it rejects direct requests from foreign authorities unless they come through Swiss channels. That distinction matters a lot, because a provider handing over the limited identifying information it actually has is not the same thing as that provider being able to read all your encrypted emails whenever it wants. What this story shows is something I have said over and over again, especially on stream. Privacy and anonymity are not the same thing. A service like Proton can absolutely provide far more privacy than Gmail or Outlook, because Proton is designed to minimize what it can access, and because it encrypts message content in ways mainstream providers generally do not, Proton says it does not have access to encrypted message content. But Proton also says that because of SMTP limitations, it still has access to some metadata and account activity records, and it may also have payment-related information or account recovery links that users voluntarily provide. That is the key. If you give a service identifying information, then yes, that information can still identify you. That does not mean the encryption failed. That does not mean the privacy model is fake. That means you attached your identity to the account in some way. And that is not just a Proton problem. That is an internet problem. As we've discussed with the growing identity verification problem being pushed by many countries and states in the United States and such, we've talked about in other videos. We're not going to go deeper down the rabbit hole right now. But in Proton's own guidance on using Proton Mail more anonymously, it says you can improve anonymity by using Tor or VPNs consistently and by skipping a recovery email, because linking your Proton account to another email makes it easier to identify you. In other words, Proton itself is very clearly telling users that privacy by default is not the same thing as full anonymity. So when people react to this story as though Proton promised some kind of magical invisibility cloak like Harry Potter offers, that is not Proton lying. That is people not understanding the threat model to begin with. No legitimate provider is above the law. This is another thing that keeps making me feel like people have their heads fully up their ass. No legitimate service provider anywhere gets to just say, nah, we don't do laws. That is not how business works. That is not how jurisdictions work. That is not how warrants, court orders, or international legal assistance works. Proton's transparency report says that under Swiss law, it cannot directly comply with foreign law enforcement requests. those requests have to go through Swiss authorities, and then Swiss law is the standard being applied. Proton also says that from time to time, it can be legally compelled to disclose certain user information to Swiss authorities, but it cannot decrypt encrypted mailbox content. That is actually one of Proton's big advantages. The advantage is not that it can ignore law forever. The advantage is that a foreign government cannot just email Proton directly and bypass Swiss legal process. They have to go through the Swiss system first. That matters. But it does not mean Proton is immune from lawful process. No country is immune to lawful process. No real company is immune to lawful process. This is how it works in Switzerland. This is how it works in Germany. This is how it works in the United States. This is how it works basically everywhere. If the company has data and the courts in that jurisdiction determine they have to provide that data, they have to provide it. Point blank. This is also why the 404 media context matters so much, because if people leave out the fact that this was reportedly connected to a Stop Cop City / Defend the Atlanta Forest account, then the whole conversation gets flattened into vague social media outrage. But that context is exactly what makes this a case about how lawful requests work, what kind of account link data exists, and how people get themselves in trouble when they mistake a privacy tool for an anonymity tool. Again, according to 404 Media, the court record said the FBI got payment data from Proton through Swiss authorities and used that to determine who was allegedly behind the account. That is the reported fact pattern people are reacting to. Not decrypted inbox contents, not Proton secretly breaking encryption, payment-linked identification. So let's discuss Alice and Bob and how email actually works. Because frankly, a lot of people talking about this clearly do not understand how email works. So let's use the classic Alice and Bob email analogy. Alice wants to send Bob an email. Alice writes her message and sends it through her email provider. Her provider then relays the message towards Bob's provider using protocols like SMTP. In most modern setups, that connection between email providers and gateways is protected by TLS, meaning the message is encrypted in transit while moving between those servers. That is good, but that is not the same thing as true end-to-end encryption. Why? Because providers often still need some degree of access or processing ability for legitimate reasons like spam filtering, phishing detection, malware scanning, abuse prevention, routing and delivery, enterprise security controls, policy enforcement, and this is common practice in both personal and business email. And Proton's own privacy policy says this pretty directly. Proton says it does not have access to encrypted message content, but unencrypted messages sent from external providers to your Proton account or from Proton to external unencrypted email services are scanned for spam and viruses in memory before being encrypted and written to disk. Proton also says it has access to certain metadata because of SMTP limitations, including sender and recipient email addresses, subject lines, timestamps, attachment names, and incoming IP addresses for inbound messages. So the clean way to explain this is email is often encrypted between provider gateways, but that does not automatically mean only Alice and Bob can read it. If Alice sends to Bob through ordinary email and they are not using a real end-to-end encryption method, then the providers still play a meaningful role in handling that mail. That is why I keep saying email is old technology with a newer privacy-focused outfit. So let's get into what Proton changes and what it does not. Where Proton is different is that Proton says Proton to Proton email and end-to-end encrypted is end-to-end encrypted by default. And Proton says it has no means to decrypt that protected content on its own systems. That is a meaningful privacy and security improvement. And if you use PGP, pretty good privacy, properly with someone outside Proton, then yes, that can also get you true end-to-end encrypted email. But most email in the real world is still not living in that perfect world. If you're emailing between random providers and not using PGP, then what you often have is transport encryption, some encryption at rest, better privacy practices depending on the provider, but not necessarily full end-to-end encryption the way people imagine it. And even with PGP, metadata is still a problem. Subject lines, routing information, and a bunch of surrounding context are not all magically hidden just because you encrypted the email body. So again, email can be made more private. It can be made more secure. It can even be made end-to-end encrypted in the right scenarios. But anonymity, that is a much harder problem. PGP is the thing almost nobody uses, and this is also where a lot of people show that they love the idea of encrypted email more than the reality of it. Because when people say email is end-to-end encrypted, what they often really mean is, I assume the provider handled that for me everywhere. Not necessarily. Outside of closed ecosystems like Proton to Proton, true end-to-end email usually means PGP, and almost nobody actually uses PGP correctly in the real world. I even have my public PGP key out there for people to use. Almost nobody ever does. I think only 3 people have ever actually used it to communicate with me, and one of those was Proton themselves. That tells you everything you need to know. People love the theory. Very few people are actually living it. So when I say email was never that great, I mean it. Email is still old infrastructure with layers bolted onto it to make it feel less bad. That does not mean it is useless. It means you need to understand its limitations. What Proton directly has that can identify you, though, this is an important nuance, because I want to phrase it correctly. When people talk about what Proton has on you, the most obvious identity linking things users voluntarily provide are usually payment information, recovery email, and in some cases, IP-related data if lawfully compelled in a specific investigation. Proton's own anonymity guidance explicitly says skipping recovery email makes it more difficult to identify you, and the 404 case specifically revolves around payment data. Meanwhile, Proton's 2021 public clarification about the climate activist case shows that IP logging can become an issue if Swiss authorities lawfully compel it in a specific case. So the broader lesson is this. Historically, when these public Proton controversies happen, they are usually not about Proton decrypting mailbox content. They are usually about account-linked identifying data, especially things like payment records, recovery links, or IP-related information gathered under lawful process. That is a much more accurate way to say it, because again, Proton's privacy policy makes it clear. It also has access to certain metadata due to the nature of email. So I would not oversimplify it into only payment and recovery email. The better phrasing is that those are often the most obvious identity anchors people voluntarily attach to the account. Now, for the people saying just use Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, and yes, I know some of you are just going to come out and say that. Okay, fine, don't use your credit card, use Bitcoin. And sure, using Bitcoin may be better than directly attaching your normal personal credit card to an account, but Bitcoin is not anonymous. Bitcoin is pseudo-anonymous. There are still ways to correlate wallet activity, exchange records, KYC data, reused addresses, transaction behavior, and other supporting data points to work toward identifying a person. We're not going down the entire blockchain analysis rabbit hole in this video, but the point is simple. Bitcoin is not a magic invisibility cloak handed to you by Harry Potter. It can reduce one obvious trail. It can make you harder to identify if you are careful, but it can still be de-anonymized with enough supporting information, and that is one of the reasons a lot of us in the cybersecurity community have historically had a much bigger appreciation for Monero when the conversation is specifically about privacy. In fact, I run my own private Monero node that I've discussed quite a bit, especially on stream, for my own Monero-related transactions, and I have some stuff on my GitHub related to Pinode XMR, including enhancements I have done using Prometheus and Grafana. So let me know in the comments if you want me to do a separate video on Pinode XMR, Monero nodes, and some of the enhancements I have done there, because that is absolutely something I can cover in another video. Just understand the bigger point. Switching from a credit card to Bitcoin may reduce one obvious identity trail. It does not magically solve the anonymity problem. And no, running your own email server is not the answer either. And then, of course, there is the other galaxy brain take people always jump to whenever I bring this up. Fine, I'll just run my own email server. No. Friends do not let friends run their own email servers. And I say that as someone who has operated an email server before, eventually moved my server over to Proton many years ago. Let me tell you what you're actually signing up for. You need a domain. That domain is registered somewhere. You need your registrar's information. You need infrastructure. That means an ISP, host, or provider. That provider has information if you want clean deliverability. Now you're dealing with SPF, DKIM, DMARC, reverse DNS, IP reputation, abuse handling, spam tuning, monitoring, maintenance, and all the other nonsense that comes with trying to keep a mail server alive and accepted by the wider ecosystem, such as you're going to probably need a static IP, and your ISP is going to know it's you because you got a static IP. If you use business internet, which pretty much is a requirement for a static IP, that's another trail. If you pay for hosting, that's another trail. If your logs exist, that's another trail. So again, self-hosting email can change who you trust. It does not make the problem of attribution magically disappear. You are not escaping reality. You are merely moving the trust boundary and then adding operational pain. And yes, I will disclose this clearly too. I am affiliated with Proton. I am also affiliated with Tuta. I recommend both. I will even have links down below in the description in my links, as I think both are still great services. I think both are much better options for people who care about privacy than mainstream surveillance-heavy ecosystems. But both are still email providers operating in real jurisdictions under real legal systems. That is not hypocrisy. That is reality. And if anything, that is exactly why understanding the threat model matters so much, because good privacy tools are not magic. They're not silver bullets. They are tools. And tools only make sense when you understand what problems they solve and what problems they do not solve, and even what problems they may introduce. So the takeaway from the story should not be Proton betrayed everybody. The takeaway should be, if you attach identifying information to an account, do not be shocked when that identifying information can identify you. If you do not understand the difference between privacy and anonymity, you are going to keep misunderstanding these stories. If you assume email itself is some perfect anonymous dead drop, you are already starting from the wrong premise. And if you actually care about secure communications, then you need to understand: what is end-to-end encrypted? What is only encrypted in transit? What metadata exists? What the provider can and cannot access? What your payment trail looks like? What your recovery trail looks like? What your IP trail looks like? And what your OPSEC looks like? Privacy and anonymity is primarily about behavior and usage of how you use tools, rather than that you are using tools at all. That is the real lesson here. Not hysteria, not rage bait, not hot takes from people who clearly do not understand how email works, just reality. And reality is that privacy, anonymity, and encryption are three very different conversations. Anyway, that's my take on it. I'm Chief Geeked. If you're into cybersecurity, Linux, and open source content, make sure to hit like, subscribe, follow all of my socials, catch me on live streams, and let me know, what do you think down in the comments below? Do you think too many people are treating privacy like anonymity? Do you think most people fundamentally do not understand how email works? And do you want me to do a separate video on Pinode XMR, Monero, and some of the Prometheus Grafana enhancements I have built around my own node setup? We can get into that after the Zero Trusting project I have finished up, which has been making great strides if you've been following that in the Discord and Matrix servers, which you're more than welcome to join, as well as follow the projects over on my GitHub. Links are all down below. Let me know all down below about any of those questions I've asked you and all of your thoughts. I'm curious to see what you're thinking out there. And as always, stay safe and happy hacking. Catch you in the next one.